Good evening. I'm Mark Evanier, and welcome to another one of these little webcasts where I drag a friend of mine in front of his camera and make him talk to me for a couple of hours. I have known Steve Stoliar for 8 years. I know this because the first time we met in person was shortly before my 60th birthday, which was 8 years ago in March. And we got along so well that our lunch ran like 3 hours, I believe. And at the end of it, I invited Steve to come to my birthday party because I figured he was going to end up being part of my circle of friends anyway. He might as well start meeting them, and most of them would be there. Steve, do you recall that birthday party?
I do. Did I get you anything?
No. And so I'm forcing you to do this in compensation.
All right.
You met some interesting people at that party.
Oh, my, yes.
Yes.
Well, Stan Freberg was there.
Yes. Now, we're going to be talking about people who inspired us when we were younger. And Stan Freberg was a man who inspired me, and you as well, I believe.
Yeah. He was, I mean, certainly from the commercials initially, and then a deeper dive into the records and animated voices. And boy, he was a Renaissance man, which isn't to say he was born 500 years too late.
Now, leaving us, let's put aside for a moment the guy with the cigar and the mustache. Who else?
No, that's Stan Freberg did not have a cigar and a mustache. You've been misinformed.
Sorry.
Common mistake.
Who besides Julius H. Marx inspired you over the years in your early days?
Yeah.
Okay, Porky Pig is one. All right.
Gosh, who did
you must have laughed? You must have laughed at somebody besides Groucho.
Well, I laughed at people in real life and hoped not to get caught by them in classrooms and so on. Well, I mean, as a kid, I liked the silent clowns, you know, Chaplin and Keaton and Lloyd, and used to watch old-timey movies on TV with the silent guys. I did enjoy the Three Stooges when I was 6, and actually got to see Larry, Moe, and Curly Joe when I was still living in St. Louis, where I was born. They were on a tour promoting one of their feature films. And it was exciting to see them, although I didn't understand why they looked so much older than they did on our Zenith television set, because I didn't know that I was looking at short films from the 30s made at Columbia. And Larry's hair was slicked back, and Moe said, "This is Larry. He combs his hair with an egg beater." And even at 6, I thought that joke doesn't work because he doesn't have his hair frizzed out. It doesn't look like he combs his hair with an egg beater. It looks like he uses a comb. So that was my first introduction to celebrity encounters. And
I'll bet Curly Joe looked so old he looked like a completely different person.
That didn't make sense either, because I hadn't seen any. I don't know which feature it was, but I hadn't seen any of the feature things, so I didn't know about the whole replacement of Curly with Shemp and then Besser. And Joe Besser was, by the way, a cousin of ours, although I never met him. And it was not, he weren't blood kin, but he was through marriage somehow a cousin of ours.
All right. Now, did anyone on TV make you laugh? Was there any TV show you loved dearly when you were younger?
Sergeant Kangaroo.
Sergeant Bilko?
Captain Kangaroo.
All right.
Television shows. Well, I even was able to appreciate Ernie Kovacs early on. I loved the Nairobi Trio. That cracked me up, even though I was too young to really understand what I was laughing at. Later on, of course, the Dick Van Dyke Show, and in adolescence, Laugh-In. And I ended up sending some jokes into Laugh-In and getting a letter back from the head writer, and I offered to work for them for $1.98, and he said, "Congratulations on picking the amount of money George Schlatter likes to pay, and you obviously have an ear for humor and should be encouraged to keep at it." Alan Mannings was the head writer, so that had a big influence on me. Also, it was very shortly after my mom had passed away when I was 15. So getting a letter from Laugh-In saying, keep at it, was a big spirit booster.
Okay. Now, at what age did you think of being in the comedy business?
Ooh, business? I don't know. I don't think I ever took comedy seriously. How's that for a phrase? I always had a knack for it. I could make people laugh doing funny voices and make funny faces when I was a kid and do impressions of people in our circle of acquaintances. But I didn't really think money could be earned that way. Even into college, I was initially a history major because I had a passion for archaeology and paleontology. I still do. And I was initially a history major before finally shifting over to motion picture television and trying my hand at writing. I think the first thing, when I was still in college, my roommate Daryl and I heard a rumor that the Carol Burnett show was running dry of ideas and they were looking for writers. So we thought, all right, we've got nothing to lose. So we wrote some sketches where Carol Burnett was the extra girl in department stores and Harvey Korman would be her martinet boss, you know. And we sent it to them and got a very nice letter saying, thank you for letting us see these. You need to keep in mind that genuine comedy comes out of real life situations, and your situations were too contrived. So that was our lesson. That Saturday, we turned on the Carol Burnett show in time to see the end of a sketch where a 20-foot tall roll of toilet paper crashed through a bathroom and squashed Carol Burnett. So there's our lesson in basing comedy on real life experiences.
Well, that perhaps actually happened. So there are people, by the way, these days hoarding those toilet papers, those big toilet
Well,
papers.
yes, little did we know we could have invested in it then. But the idea of working in a department store was just preposterous.
Okay, now tell us about the first time you laid eyes on Groucho Marx, or he made you laugh, or where did you first see him?
Well, there was an influence that he had before I knew who he was. I had an Uncle Joe who was balding, had glasses, a mustache, smoked a cigar, and wiggled his eyebrows up and down, and had a great sense of humor. And my parents would say, quote lines from the films like, you must have been vaccinated with a phonograph needle. And it really was, I guess, high school when I saw an actual Marx Brothers film on TV, and I just immediately fell in love and wondered where they had been all my life. And of the trio or quartet, Groucho was immediately my favorite because of his wordplay and witticisms and saying the kind of things you'd like to say, but you can't because you'll get in trouble.
Okay, but you liked Harpo as well?
Oh, my, yes.
Chico as well?
I did.
You even tolerated Zeppo.
I tolerated Zeppo, yes. Little did I know that our paths would cross years later.
What was that first film? Which one was it?
You know, I don't remember. I think it was one of the Paramounts, but I don't, because those cycled heavily in the MCA. It always bothered me. They had that shield and it said MCA release. And I wanted to draw an N after MCA, but then, you know, the TV set would have had paint on it, which Dad would have frowned upon. He often frowned upon paint.
So you immediately sought out other Marx Brothers movies? Did you?
I did, and it was difficult back then because, of course, some of your younger viewers or listeners would take for granted that now if you hear about an old movie, you can call it up as a streaming thing or on some device, handheld device or TCM or whatever. But back then I would get the TV guide, and each week I would go through it and I would circle the movies I wanted to see. Invariably they were on in the late night, early morning hours, but somehow I was able to will myself to stay awake past Carson, past the Tomorrow Show, into the netherworld of Cal Worthington commercials, and then I would finally see Horse Feathers or Monkey Business or any number of early Paramount films.
I experienced something. Now, I wonder if you had a comparable situation. I was a fan of the Marx Brothers movies. I saw them on TV like you did. And then one evening, my friend Rob, who was similarly in love with the Marx Brothers, and I were down in Long Beach. And we went to the New State Theater, and there was a double feature of Night at the Opera and Day at the Races, with a very lively, raucous, Marx-loving audience. And those films were 25 times as good on that screen that night. Yeah. And I had a brand new appreciation of the Marx Brothers that I didn't have when I was watching those films at home on a little black and white set, or, well, it didn't really matter if you watched them on a black and white set or not. But and I later found out that the New State Theater was the theater where famously they previewed Night at the Opera and got a very bad reaction to it.
Right.
Anyway, but I didn't really become a Marx Brothers fan as fervent as I became until I saw them with a live audience. Did you have anything comparable in your existence?
It was difficult to see it with an audience because if it was on late night TV, it was just me. However, now that you bring it up, I remember they showed A Night at the Opera in 2 parts at my high school on lunch hour. They showed half the movie, and then the next day, the second half. So I at least got to see it. Eating I can still taste the very dry burrito that I had for lunch that day. Drier than Groucho's wit was that bean burrito, but it was great to see it with other people. And yes, it does make a difference. And it certainly makes a difference with the MGM films, since they built in pauses for people to laugh, which is why they seem a little slower if you see them by yourself. And then the Paramount films just are like shooting a bullet out of a gun. They're just nonstop, short, funny after funny films.
Someone will ask this in the comments section if I don't. What's your favorite Marx Brothers movie? And you only get one. What? You only get one.
Soup.
Okay.
But I will say that there is essentially a magical trio of their films, Monkey Business, Horse Feathers, Duck Soup, spanning the mighty era of 31 to 33. And any of them could be said to have been their funniest film. It was sort of like they were clearing their throats with Coconuts and Animal Crackers, which were stagey, based on stage plays, had microphones that were stapled to the floor. And then they did those 3 at Paramount that just were them at their peak. And those are the ones that I think held up best over the years when they were rediscovered in the 60s and 70s. A Night at the Opera may be their best film, but not their funniest film because of the production values. And, it was a bigger deal. It meant the world to Groucho for them to be signed by MGM, because that was the, Rolls Royce of studios. But Duck Soup, if I had to pick one, Duck Soup. But if you said, gee, why do you like Duck Soup? I prefer Monkey Business or Horse Feathers. I would not wrestle you to the floor. I wouldn't wrestle you to the floor anyway, but.
Yeah, good, because I prefer Monkey Business or Horse Feathers. But
okay, I'm leaving.
Okay, all right.
Okay, I'm back.
Good.
I forgive you.
Okay.
As long as you didn't say, The Big Store or Go West. These are movies that have their moments, but, a consistently funny comedy is not made up of occasional moments. So,
okay.
and it's unfortunate that they only made a dozen movies, because unlike Laurel and Hardy and the Three Stooges that cranked out all those short films and then feature films, we only have this precious dozen films, and half of them I'm just not that crazy about. So there you know.
All right. Now, Name me your favorite Marx Brothers scene.
Boy, I wish you had provided me with these ahead of time, because this will call into question my reputation as being quick. My favorite Marx Brothers scene, I can't. It's picking snowflakes out of a blizzard. There's visual stuff, there's verbal stuff.
I'll tell you mine. I think the single funniest Marx Brothers scene is not the stateroom scene in Night at the Opera, which is the easy answer.
Yes.
I think it is the scene in Monkey Business, where they decide that in order to get off the ship, they have to use Maurice Chevalier's passport. And so not only do they all have to pretend to be the same person, they have to pretend to be someone that none of them could possibly be. And they decide, as if it's obvious, that if you are traveling under Maurice Chevalier's passport, you must sing a song as Maurice Chevalier.
Right.
And
you brought a new kind of love to me. And then, that's not a message to you, Mark. That was
thank you.
They were saying.
And then what proceeds to happen is that each of them, in their own way, tries to make it go as wrong as possible. It's like they're not even trying to pass themselves off.
I never got the impression they were trying to make it go wrong. I thought they were trying to pass themselves off as Chevalier.
And Harpo is rubber stamping the official's head.
But Harpo has the recording of the actual Chevalier, and he lip syncs to "If a Nightingale Could Sing Like You." And for one brief shining moment, the authorities are puzzled why he sounds like Chevalier, and perhaps they've been hasty in thinking that this guy with the blonde curly wig and overcoat and top hat might just be Maurice Chevalier in disguise, because he sounds just like him.
And they also don't notice that suddenly there is musical accompaniment.
Well, that's what happens in the movies. You know that in Coconuts, the producer said that in order to have someone sing a song in the film, they had to have the orchestra on stage, because people are going to wonder where the sound is coming from, because it was only like 2 years into sound films, and they were trying to apply logic to that, saying you can't have someone start to sing a song and you hear violins and all that, because people are going to want to know where they are. So they dressed them up and planted them in the scene, and I think they aren't even caught on camera. And of course, nobody gave a shit that there's music, because you just accepted it.
The music came from the same place that the title cards did in the silent films. It was just there. So, all right. Now, before we leave the subject of these films in particular, Scott Olson in our audience has a question. Hey, Steve, I have your book and I've even read it. That's a good start. Question. Back in the day, A Night at the Opera was the Marxist pinnacle. Now it's considered duck soup. When and why the change, in your opinion?
I think audience tastes changed. Their biggest moneymaker was A Day at the Races, the sequel to Night at the Opera. And I think most people in, I guess, my father's generation would have chosen Night at the Opera and Day at the Races as their best films. And as I say, production values-wise, they are. But then in the 60s, the Marx Brothers and Mae West and W.C. Fields were embraced by the anti-establishment, iconoclastic baby boomers. And that all three of those comedy people groups experienced something of a renaissance, because they were discovering their films and the stuff seemed really fresh. And Duck Soup, Groucho was the head of a country, and they go to war. And of course, Vietnam was still going on then. Now I'm going to hop up on my soapbox. And I'd like to mention that if people like to laud Duck Soup as a wry satire on the futility of war. And it may appear to be that, but anyone who thinks that the writers, the director, or any of the four Marx Brothers were intending to satirize the futility of war are reading too much into it, because they were, as they all said, just trying to be funny. And even Joe Adamson, who wrote Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and sometimes Zeppo, wonderful book, was able to interview Leo McCarey in the 60s and asked him about that. And McCarey just shook his head and said that was the last thing on our minds. So I think it's possible that sometimes these films get analyzed and under too powerful a microscope, and people see things that were not the intention of the filmmakers, even though it may trigger those thoughts now. Okay, I'm done.
All right, good. You can get off your stuff. You can step off your soapbox now,
man,
sir. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Now, I went around seeing the Marx Brothers movies wherever I could with audiences. And they were running them in different revival houses in LA, and they were showing them different places. I even took a few dates to them because it was a nice thing it was like something exotic. I'm taking you to see them you never heard of before with these magical men. And the films were easy to watch, if nothing else, even if some of the jokes seemed dated. And then we went to see the Big Store, and a couple more times at the opera.
There's a real aphrodisiac taking a date to see the Big Store, to see Tony Martin singing the Tenement Symphony.
Well, here comes the best name drop we both share here, you more than me. When I met Groucho, I told him that I had taken dates to see Marx Brothers movies, and he said, "Did you get laid? I hope you got laid." and I hadn't, but I thought he would be pleased if I said I did. So I said I had, and he went, "That's great." And he said, "Imagine young kids getting laid because of my movies. I couldn't get laid because of them." The wording was a little messy.
So the first time you met Groucho, you lied to him.
That's right. Yes, I lied to him. Absolutely.
That's terrible.
Shamelessly, yes, but only to please him. Anyway, so my friends and I went to whatever we could find, and I think that the Night at the Opera and Day at the Races may have gotten some of their esteem because, at least in our area, they were more accessible. They were more likely to turn up, and they also kept turning up in those MGM compilation films of their great movies.
The big parade of comedy.
Whatever they were doing, MGM was exploiting those movies more than Paramount was.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that might be also an answer to the question of why did the opera...
I've completely forgotten that there was a question asked.
Yes, anyway.
I certainly hope we didn't answer it.
So the one film we didn't get to see was Animal Crackers, which nobody was showing, and it was unavailable.
You should have seen it.
Well, we eventually all did. And the way we saw, my friend Rob and I saw it, was that someone tipped us off that there was going to be a Marx Brothers movie fest at a certain little hole-in-the-wall place in Westwood one night. It was actually in the back of a travel agency. There was this little 35-seat theater. And we were told, hey, they're going to be running Marx Brothers movies there. And I said, which ones? And they said, we're not allowed to say, hint, hint. And it was like a badly kept secret that it was going to be Animal Crackers.
Okay.
So we went to this thing because, and of course, this is the context now in the days before home video and such, thinking if this is indeed a showing of Marx Brothers, of Animal Crackers, this might be the only time we'll ever get to see it. This one time, because these prints are not around and such. And we went in, and years later, when there was this big thing to do for a couple of weeks in this country about snuff films.
Oh,
where
yeah.
Supposedly there were these movies where someone was,
which was an urban myth,
murdered on camera, and
Yeah.
people were having these secret screenings that cost a lot of money to get into to see one of these things, and you had to pass a secret test to get in there, and you go in and see something very forbidden and exotic, and anyway.
Right.
And that's kind of how it felt to go to see Animal Crackers. Everyone was paranoid that the police were going to come,
right, flashlights in your face,
and arrest us all for seeing Animal Crackers.
This is not for you to see.
We were going to do hard time for this flaunting, and we went to see, and it was a very mediocre print with 35 people there. It was a little anticlimactic because it wasn't as magical an experience as it should have been, because we were all, actually, I think people were all just like acting like it was the one time we'd ever see it, so we better study it carefully and such. And then, not that long after that, Animal Crackers was available again. How did that happen?
Magic. You
Okay.
wished you clapped your hands and said, if you all clap your hands really hard, Animal Crackers will be re-released. Wait, I'm confusing that with Tinkerbell's death. I'm sorry.
Right. Okay.
Well, it's like this, Mark. We had a similar experience, my friends and I, when we heard that there was going to be a screening of Animal Crackers in December of '73 at the Old Town Music Hall Theater in Anaheim. And all my friends were Marx Brothers fans, and this was the great missing link in the films that were out. The only way we were able to hear any of it was on that album that Gary Owens narrated that had clips from the Paramount films. Somehow there were clips from Animal Crackers included in that. I don't know if they just did it and no one was the wiser, or if they got permission somehow. But that was the only way any of us had heard anything about it. But we blew a tank of gas driving down to Orange County in the midst of what was then an energy crisis and a gas shortage. And we watched probably the sister print of the one you saw. It was doopy. It was hard to understand. You couldn't see much of anything, but damn, it was Animal Crackers. And we finally saw it. And in my naivete, I thought, I wonder if Groucho would like to know that this is available for viewing, because maybe he hasn't seen it in years either. So I knew that his phone number wasn't in the phone book, but I did know that Harry Ruby's was, and I knew who Harry Ruby was because of my fanatic obsession with the Marx Brothers, that he was one of Groucho's longtime friends, figures prominently in the Groucho letters, and wrote the music. He wrote Groucho's theme song, Hooray for Captain Spaulding, from Animal Crackers with Burt Kalmar. And then he and Burt were screenwriters on some of their Paramount films. And so I thought, I'm going to call Harry Ruby and tell him that this is available. So I called and I got a nurse instead of Harry Ruby. And if Harry himself had answered the phone, none of what happened after that would have happened, because that was the only reason my phone number was taken down at Ruby's house. So Harry Ruby called me back, and at the time it was the biggest thrill of my life talking to this guy whose name I had seen roll by at the end of these movies. And he said, well, I'll be sure and tell Grouch. And I thought, oh my God, Harry Ruby is going to tell Groucho Marx something. And then New Year's Day of 1974, I got a phone call from a woman named Erin Fleming. And I and I knew who she was, again, because I'd been following everything about him. And I knew that she was the woman on the cover of Esquire, where Groucho is next to her and they're sort of embracing. And I knew that she was a big part of Groucho's life. And as an aside, I should probably say that in '72, I did see Groucho from the back of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion when he did his one-man show. And it was rough because he was old and frail, and the press had gone out of their way to say, good old Groucho at 80, just as sharp as ever. And I saw this old man shuffle out and read off of 3x5 cards, and it was sort of heartbreaking, but it was also electrifying to see him. And Erin was part of that show as well.
I was there for that show. It was the first time you and I were in the same room at the same time.
I wish you had slumped down a little bit because you interfered with my sight line.
Oh, okay. But well, I didn't know where you should have bought better seats.
$9.50, which wouldn't get you a parking spot now, but that was a lot of money for me then. Anyway, so I knew who Erin was, and all she wanted to know was, how was I able to see Animal Crackers? No one is supposed to be able to see Animal Crackers. what right did they have? And it's like, she was giving me the third degree on why it was wrong they were showing it, and I was just trying to do a good deed. And then as we talked more, she thought, maybe I'll take you with me to Universal to meet Sid Sheinberg, who was the president of MCA at the time, and explain to him that here is this kid that went with his friends to Orange County to see Animal Crackers, and that's why Universal should bring the film out again. But she had to go because she and Groucho were going to see Sleeper, as a matter of fact. And we stayed in touch, and I would get phone calls at all hours, and I felt really privileged that this woman that was, a heartbeat away from Groucho Marx was calling me to talk about stuff. And that is how the committee for the re-release of Animal Crackers started when I was a student at UCLA. Instead of just taking me to see Sid Sheinberg, you'll fix that before this broadcast. You could just edit that out.
I bet you're not the first person to make that mistake.
Sheinberg? Yeah, the people who knew him probably made a point of it. God, I heard awful stories about him. Is that he was just such a ruthless studio head. I worked after the Groucho years, I worked in the steno pool at Universal, typing Rockford Files and Kojaks and Berettas, and you would hear stories about. And one story was that one of the heads of post-production called Sheinberg and said, "You've got to do something about the conditions here. Some of the editors they're having heart attacks, they're having nervous breakdowns, they're drinking, their marriages are falling apart, they're dropping like flies." And Sheinberg said, "Then get more flies," and hung up the phone. Isn't that nice? Anyway.
That's very good. That's adorable, man.
Oh, yeah. So at any rate, we multiplied the striking power of just having me vouch for the fact that I would like to see Animal Crackers released. And we started this committee. The reason it hadn't been seen was because the Paramount films made before 49 had been purchased by MCA Universal in the late 50s. And they packaged those and reissued them on television with those MCA release logos at the beginning. And Animal Crackers was among them. However, due to essentially a clerical error, the copyright had expired on Animal Crackers and had reverted back to the authors and composers of the Broadway play, Bert Kalmer, Harry Ruby, Maury Riskind, and George S. Kaufman, who was Groucho's personal hero. And Universal didn't think there was any point in spending money to untangle the legal rights on an old black and white Marx Brothers movie when they could pour money into important movies like Airport 75 and Downhill Racer. But we started this committee drive, and Erin actually arranged for Groucho to come to UCLA.
I believe we have a photo. Hold on here. Take a look here of this.
How dare you interrupt my narrative? Hey, there is Groucho. There's Erin smelling her finger for reasons beyond me. And that is me with my mutton chops and Groucho button and my carrying one of the petitions, saying something and trying to act nonchalant while my heart was beating out of my chest at that point. I said, "Groucho, I am very happy to be meeting you after all this time." And he said, "Well, you should be." And Erin said, "This is Steve Stoliar. He's the one who's trying to get Animal Crackers re-released." And Groucho said, "Well, did you get it?" And I said, "No, but we're working on it." And he said, "You better or I'll fire you." And I said, I didn't even realize I was working for you. How much are you paying me?" And he said, "A little less than nothing." And we sat there talking to the news people. There was a big crowd of students around, and there were television reporters and newspaper reporters. And Groucho did all right. I remember one reporter saying, Mr. Marx, what is the purpose of your appearance here today? I expect to get lunch. But besides that, I may get dinner. And so he was funny and Groucho-y in and around our talking about wanting to get Animal Crackers released. And after that, Universal relented, and they released the film in Westwood and in New York, basically just to humor us. And it ended up breaking the house record at the UA Westwood, which had been set by the French Connection several years earlier. And it was very gratifying for me as a UCLA student to go down there and see a line all the way down the block of all these young people that, contrary to what Universal thought, really did want to pay good money to see an old black and white Marx Brothers movie.
Okay, that's it. This is a good thing. All right. So now,
and I'll tell you, it's very gratifying now when some of these kids today, which of course is anyone under 60 for us, will say, Animal Crackers was the first Marx Brothers movie I ever saw. I saw it on TV, or I saw it at a film festival or something. And I think that's a statement none of us could make until the Committee for the Re-Release of Animal Crackers did their thing in '74.
Okay. Let me just tell the people in the chat room here, hold your questions for the time being, because I've got a whole trajectory here. We'll get to them later, and I don't want them to all scroll off here so we can.
I didn't know you had a trajectory.
Yes. Well, I'm trying to do this somewhat chronologically here.
Okay.
All right. So now you segued from that into the Marx home.
They brought the film out, and it did well, and it was very gratifying, and I'd met my hero, but I was greedy because I wanted more Groucho time than just that afternoon on Brew and Walk for the press. And that summer, 2 jobs fell through, for which I remain eternally grateful. And my dad was saying, I don't want you sitting on your fanny all summer. You go out, you get a job, you bring in some. And I thought, well, I have nothing to lose. So I called Erin Fleming and I said, is there anything at all that you think possibly I might be? And she said, well, actually, I used to be Groucho's secretary, but now I'm his manager, and we really need someone to handle all of the fan mail that's been building up, and someone who knows their Marx Brothers to organize all of Groucho's memorabilia, which is going to be donated to the Smithsonian after he's gone. And in my mind's eye, it's like a Tex Avery cartoon where I show up on the doorstep while she's still on the phone explaining the job to me. It felt that fast. Actually, I thought that I would maybe be working in an office building on Wilshire, and Groucho would come in once a month to sign checks or something, and I'd get to see him. She said, oh, no, dear. There's a room here that you can use as your office, and you can make your own hours, and you can come and go as you please. And they were paying me money to go to Groucho Marx's house and immerse myself in, like ankle deep in scrapbooks that were filled with reviews from their vaudeville acts and Broadway shows, photos of the brothers out of makeup, letters from famous people. And it had all just sort of been put in filing cabinets and in like a Fibber McGee's closet, just no organization. And so I was able to give some, meaning basically chronologically to all these things. But there were scripts with Groucho's handwritten notations on changes in the lines. And then to my delight, I found out that at lunchtime, I was not expected to eat in the kitchen with the help, even though that's all I really was. I was his secretary and archivist, I suppose you would say. It was a very egalitarian household. And so I would be at the lunch table with Groucho, and sometimes it would just be Groucho. Sometimes it would be Groucho and Erin, or Groucho and a nurse. Or sometimes, if I were lucky, it would be Hal Cantor or Jack Lemmon or George Burns or Steve Allen, or, and I would get to listen and occasionally participate, but mostly I listened, sometimes running into the next room to scribble down funny things Groucho said, which found their way into the book I wrote. But and I couldn't believe I was being paid money for this.
Were you being paid? Were you being paid? I'm not asking you the amount, but you feel you were being paid fairly?
Yes, I started at $3.50 an hour at a time when minimum wage was $1.19 or something like that. So, and my expenses were minimal because I was a student and I didn't have a big social life, and so it really the idea that they would give me $3.50 an hour to meet with Groucho and I've took full advantage of how fortunate I was in the conversations I had with Groucho, because it's, in addition to being that very man with the grease paint mustache insulting Margaret Dumont or talking to George Fenneman on You Bet Your Life, he was someone who knew personally as friends George Gershwin and James Thurber and W.C. Fields and all of these mythic people that he knew just as pals of his. And then as a third category, he was a man from 1890. He was well, literally a Victorian, and someone whose firsthand memories went from before the Wright brothers to after the moon landing, which is just a staggering chunk of American history. I asked him once, how far back do you remember? And he said, I guess the Spanish-American War, which was 98. And as you probably know, but some don't, the Marx Brothers started out as singers before they worked comedy into their bits. And Groucho actually was on the same bill with Enrico Caruso at a special benefit performance at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. And the money went to help victims of the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. So he was this remarkable link to all that. And of course, being a history major and fanatic, it was just an extraordinary experience, and I never took any of it for granted.
That first time I met him, we shook hands. The thought that popped into my head was, this man met H.G. Wells. I don't know why that, of all the things I could have thought of, that just... popped into my brain. I thought, wow, this is
the
a
people
lot of
that,
history.
I mean, they met him too, but the people that he crossed paths with was extraordinary. And also as an update on how let down I felt at the Dorothy Chandler and the condition he was in, I realized that in the comfort of his home, just sitting at the lunch table, there was a whole lot of classic Groucho left to him. That when you don't have 10,000 people and a spotlight on you expected to be funny right off the bat, when he was more comfortable and relaxed, the mechanism that was still Groucho was still there. He enjoyed getting the Hollywood trade papers to stay in touch with what was going on, even if he wasn't much a part of it. And then he would, I'd bring him the mail and he would review it when he came to the lunch table. And one day he said, "Wonderful mail you brought me, nothing but requests for money." And I said, "Well, but you got a variety, didn't you?" And he said, "Yes, a variety of requests for money," which is really exactly what he would have said at any previous decade. And it was always delightful when he would, twist a line and hand it back to me. One Christmas he got, yes, there we are in November 74 in his backyard. And I felt like I was posing next to a prized marlin I had landed after years of trying to get it on the boat. Yeah, wow, 74. One Christmas he got a tin of candied almonds from Fred Allen's widow, Portland. And as he walked past my room in his house, he said, "Be sure and send her one of my Christmas cards." And I said, "Don't you want to say anything personal?" And he said, "Well, Tell her thanks for the nuts. Hope you're the same. Which was just kind of charming and delightful. And again, another reminder of the fact that that mechanism was still there.
Okay. Here's a photo.
Oh, my.
Tell us about this photo.
You know, when I got it back from Zeppo, I wasn't sure if it said a wise guy, for Steve, a wise guy, a nice gay, and finally realized it was a nice guy, which was nice of him to say so. I first met Zeppo in the parking lot of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion after the semi-disappointing but still electrifying evening with Groucho. And I recognized him again from recent articles. I knew what Zeppo looked like. Also, he had that equestrian profile, you know, that, or equine, I guess I should say.
He had these huge glasses on him. Every time I saw photos of him.
He
These very
did.
large glasses, yeah.
He did, but that profile was unmistakable even in his 70s. So I thought, well, I can at least meet this Marx brother if I can't meet Groucho. So I went over and I said, excuse me, Mr. Marx, I just wanted to let you know how much I've enjoyed you in your films. And he looked at me and he said, you weren't enjoying me. You were enjoying my brothers. And I thought, oh, I'm so pleased to have been reprimanded for my compliment. Hey, there they are. Leonard, Herbert, Julius, and Adolf, the four Marx brothers. But again, as with Groucho, I got to see a different side of Zeppo in the comfort of Groucho's home. Zeppo and Gummo were the two extant Marx brothers because Chico and Harpo had died years earlier. So eventually I got to meet three Marx brothers, even if they weren't the three Marx brothers that everyone knows about. But Zeppo was going to be coming up from Palm Springs to have dinner with Groucho. And Erin Fleming said, why don't you stay and meet him? And I said, you know, I would, but I have a date tonight. And she said, bring her. And I thought, ooh, I like this, because the young lady I was seeing was very self-possessed for 19 and unflappable. And I thought, I bet this will flap her. So I picked her up. She said, where are we going? I said, it's a little out of the way place. And when I turned off Sunset onto Hillcrest, she realized where we were going. And she said, I don't want to do this. And I said, well, we're going to do this. And Zeppo was just enchanted by her. She was young and attractive, blonde hair, blue eyes, good personality. And he was kind of flirtatious. He said, you know, you and Steve, you and Linda ought to come visit me in Palm Springs sometime. And I said, I don't know. I was there when I was like 8 or 9 and it was sweltering. And he said, well, when were you there? In the summertime? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you know, Steve, it's cold in Alaska during the winter too. So at any rate, she and I ended up breaking up. And I thought, Zeppo's been around the track a few times. He had recently lost his wife to Frank Sinatra, the virulent Frank.
Who didn't? Come on.
Yes. Yeah, but officially she became Barbara Sinatra. And I had also picked up a couple of original stills of just Zeppo and Groucho, figuring if I have them sign it, it won't matter that Chico and Harpo didn't sign it because they're not in the picture. So one was duck soup and one was coconuts. So I sent it to Zeppo and let him know that Linda and I had broken up and just expected to get them signed and returned if I was lucky. And instead, I get a phone call. I didn't even know he had my number, but he must have gotten it from Erin, I guess. Steve, is Zeppo Marx. I hope I'm not bothering you. No? Listen, I got the pictures. Geez, I was good looking back then. Man. Listen, do you think that Linda would go out with me? I don't want to step on your toes. You understand? I would never want to do that. But, and I thought, this is really weird. I wrote him for advice for the Lovelorn, and he's trying to hit on her. And I said, I don't know. She kind of got a kick out of you. Let me find out, and we'll get back to you. So I called Linda, and she too thought it was kind of strange but charming. And she said, yeah, sure. So they went out once. He took her to dinner in San Diego and to a jai game in Tijuana, which I guess was Zeppo's standard first date. Dinner in San Diego, a jai game as spectators, not participants. And
that was a long date. They drove down to San Diego and then to Mexico, watched the highlight game, came
back to Westwood.
That wasn't home by midnight. All right.
So the next time I saw him, he said, Steve, I want you to know, I never even kissed her goodnight. She was very nice, but all she did was talk about herself. And then I saw Linda on campus. I said, so how was your date with Zeppo? And she said, well, he was really nice, but all he did was talk about himself. And I thought, it's kind of strange that things didn't work out between them. But after that, whenever I would see Zeppo at a party at Groucho's, he would introduce me to someone and say, this is Steve. He's a nice young man. He and I dated the same girl, but he got further with her than I did. She was 19, I was 20, and he was 74. So yeah,
but he got her to Mexico.
Yes, right. Probably under false pretenses. But
all right, yeah, all right. Let's talk about some of the other people you met hanging around Groucho's house. You met S.J. Perelman up there.
I did, and boy, he had a reputation for being a curmudgeon and kind of a misanthrope, didn't suffer fools or a lot of other people gladly. And he was coming back from one of his around the world jaunts that he would write about after doing that. He wrote Westward Ha and Eastward Ha and different books about his travels around the world and experiences he had. And as with Zeppo, he was going to be coming to Groucho's for dinner. And Erin said, why don't you stay and meet Sid? And I said, I'd like to, but I hardly think I'm dressed for it. I had blue jeans and tennis shoes and just like a striped T-shirt. And she said, oh, I'm sure he won't mind. So I stuck around Groucho's house until dinner time, and the doorbell rang. And this woman came in a full-length mink coat with diamonds on and heels. And Perelman was wearing a three-piece suit, and he was with character actor Andrew Duggan, who was also dressed to the nines. And there I was in my tennis shoes and blue jeans saying, Mr. Perelman, it's a real honor to meet you. And I felt like he was thinking, you punk, this is how you dress when you're really... So I sort of stayed on the periphery while the other people were talking. And at one point, the guests were talking about lines that Perelman had written for Groucho. And like the woman said, oh, shot an elephant in my pajamas. You wrote that, didn't you, Sid? No, that wasn't one of my lines. Oh, I vaccinated with a phonograph needle. That had to have been your... That wasn't mine, no. And so I said, the professor is waxing wroth. And he looked at me and he said, that was one of the ones that I wrote for Groucho. You're right. And I felt delighted. And during dinner, Groucho and he were cordial. And, there had been rumors that there was a coolness between them, but it wasn't in evidence then. Although afterwards, Perelman said, he took out a cigarette, said, do you mind if I smoke? And Groucho said, I don't care if you burn. And Perelman said, that was good, Groucho. Now let's try it for timing. So after that, I went back to my office. Groucho had an early draft of Horse Feathers, and I thought maybe Perelman hadn't seen it. And he went into the back of the house to use the bathroom. And on his way back, I collared him and showed him the script, and he hadn't seen it. And so he came into my office and we started talking and asked me what I was interested in doing. And I said, writing. And he advised me against writing for television or film. I should write plays because the writer has more control instead of the director and the producer. I told him about how much I loved the Algonquin Roundtable, especially Robert Benchley. And we talked about Benchley for a while. And I thought, I can't believe I'm actually engaging Perelman in conversation. And I started to hear from the living room, where's Sid? Is he okay? Was he feeling okay? Is he okay? And someone finally came back and retrieved him. But I was able to talk to him for, I don't know, 12, 15 minutes about this and that. And it was really cool. I asked him if I had one of his books. Is it possible to get it signed? I didn't have it with me. And he said, I'm staying at the Chateau Marmont. You could leave it there. I'll be happy to sign it for you. And I dropped it off. And then next time I went there, I picked it up and opened it up. And it said, for Steve Stoliar, with very cordial wishes for his ultimate success as a writer. And I thought, well, I guess I can't be a plumber or a carpenter or something, because people will say, why did this man write this in here? But that was a real high point. And then I came back to the dorm high from having had this experience with Groucho and Perelman. And I thought, I've got to tell someone about this. This is just too. And I thought, finally, my dad will be impressed. He'll know who these people were. And I called him up and I said, Dad, I have just had dinner with Groucho Marx and S.J. Perelman. And he said, yes, but are you neglecting your studies? Just popped the balloon, bang. One in a series of popped balloons. However, when I finally wrote Raised Eyebrows about my experiences, I dedicated it to Dad, who thought I was neglecting my studies. Because, of course, in terms of life, those were my studies. You can't do better than that.
And you also got an autographed book from Nat Perrin.
What does this say? For Steve, who is authorized to make any script changes he deems necessary. Yes, isn't that a thing of beauty? Nat Perrin was a great guy, very down to earth. And again, I knew his name from being such a Marx fanatic. And towards the end, he was actually appointed Groucho's temporary conservator when there was a big war going on between Erin Fleming and Groucho's son, Arthur. And Nat was seen as a sort of neutral territory. So I got to spend quality time with him. And he was great. We both loved George Gershwin. The difference is, he was sort of a contemporary. He said, I'll tell you, in 1924, I actually snuck in to Aeolian Hall in New York the night George Gershwin debuted the Rhapsody in Blue. It was at the end of a long program, and it was hot inside, and a lot of people had left, but I was such a fan, and so I got to hear that for the first time. And then he said that when he got to Hollywood, Groucho brought him out in 1931 to work on Monkey Business. He said, Groucho took me to a party, and there at the piano was George Gershwin. And I couldn't believe it. And Groucho brought me over and he said, George, this is Nat Perrin. He's the only person I know that can whistle the entire Rhapsody in Blue. But luckily, Gershwin didn't ask me. I would have had to whistle for 17 minutes. But anyway, so Nat was a great guy. And
I must say, no offense, Steve, I'm really tired of Nat Perrin impressions. Everybody does them.
I try to go out and mail a letter, and I would say 3 or 4 children will stop me and either ask for Nat Perrin or S.J. Perelman, and they say, oh my God, if I closed my eyes, I'd swear that was Nat Perrin. Yeah.
Okay. Now,
I live in a weird neighborhood.
Now, obviously, we have to talk about Ms. Fleming, but before we get to her, let me ask you a couple silly questions here. How was the food at Groucho's house?
The food at Groucho's house was very good. He had a cook named Jules Plourde, who was of French extraction by way of Canada, and he introduced me to cayenne pepper, which I use to this day to brighten up many a dish that otherwise would be kind of bland. He was very good, and it was, towards the end, I was actually staying there on weekends at Nat's request to sort of supervise the warring factions as they visited Groucho. So it was something to be getting these gourmet meals cooked for me by Jules. He had several cooks over the 3 years that I was there. Initially, Martha was wonderful. She had been with him since You Bet Your Life. And it was very accommodating and very pleasant and always had Groucho's best interests at heart. And then Erin wanted her to work on Christmas Day one year. And she said, Mr. Marx would never have me do that. And she said, well, if you can't, then I guess we just don't need you anymore, and fired her, she'd been with him for 12 or 15 years. Another of his cooks was Robin Heaney, a tall, slender blonde. Actually, one time when Zeppo and Gummo came up to have dinner at Groucho's, I was there. You know, all the Marx Brothers were fairly short, and Zeppo among the shortest of them. And Robin was very tall. Zeppo came out of the kitchen and he said, I think Robin would marry me. And Groucho said, she's too tall for you. What part of it do you want? And he said, I'll take as high up as I can reach. And Gummo said, what do you want with her feet? It was a very rare Gummo anecdote. You know, there's Groucho anecdotes and some Zeppo because he really was a character. But Gummo had the punchline there. So, and then of course there was flamboyant John, who wore mascara and ruffled sleeves and danced to disco music and had a plunging neckline and was just completely outrageous.
He was the one who dragged Groucho to see Rip Taylor. Am I right?
Yes. He arranged for Rip Taylor to. I mean, it was.
He dragged Groucho to a gay nightclub to see Rip Taylor, and then had Rip over for dinner. I think.
Well, I think it was the other way around. That John knew Rip Taylor, which came as a surprise to no one, and arranged for Rip to come to lunch one day. So they sit down, and Groucho looks at Rip Taylor and says, what do you do? And he said, I'm a comedian, Groucho. And he said, really? You haven't said anything funny yet. And Rip Taylor said, well, the way I start my show is I come out dressed in tinsel and I say, it looks like someone shot the Christmas tree. And Groucho said, and then what, you go home? But yes, after that, they did manage to drag him to see Mr. Taylor do his thing. And I don't know what Groucho thought of it, but it was a very awkward moment, followed by the clinking of forks against plates when Groucho said, and then what, you go home?
The Erin problems aside, would you say that Groucho was comfortable his last few years, that he had a good life, that he was at peace, was he uncomfortable with his place in show business history? Or did he feel
No, not
neglected?
at all. He loved the fact that there was a whole new generation. You know, it really was these kids today. They show up dressed as the Marx Brothers. And he loved the fact that he was hot again and that was getting all this fan mail. They also had resyndicated You Bet Your Life, so that was airing in a lot of cities. And he loved the attention, you know, going out for a walk and people would stop him and he would insult them and so forth. But when you say Erin aside, that's difficult because it's like saying, well, never mind the cancerous tumor. Was he healthy?
Okay. Now, did you tell me, or did I hear someplace else, that Groucho would sometimes hear the tour buses coming in his area and would go outside and act like they just caught him by chance outside? I
never saw that happen, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Okay. And he had a different, usually he didn't have a lot of tolerance for people that would come to the door, because if you think about it, it's awfully rude just to go. This was before every place was walled off with electric gates and ring following your every move and contacting the security people and all that. You really could just park on Hillcrest and walk across the driveway and up the steps and ring the bell. I would never have thought to do that if I knew Groucho's address, because it just seemed. But then every now and again, I remember one of the very few times he ever reprimanded me in the 3 years I lived there. The doorbell rang and I answered the door, and there was this guy and his wife saying, "Hi, we drove in all the way from Memphis, and we're big. Do you think we could meet Mr. Marx?" And I said, "Well, no, he's taking a nap now, but if you like, I can get you an autographed picture." And I went and got a picture that Groucho had pre-signed with his name. And then Groucho came shuffling down the hall, and he said, "What's going on?" I said, "There's a couple here that wanted to meet you." And he said, "This isn't your house. This is my house. I'll meet them if they want to meet me." And he pushed past me and opened the door and did his Groucho walk and wiggled his eyebrows. But if that's what I'm going to get reprimanded for, it was such a charming moment to see them light up like that because he did that. But that was the exception to the rule. Usually he didn't want to be bothered. So I thought that I had his best interests at heart that day.
Okay. You and I met a lot of famous people.
All right.
Some of them were people who were heroes in various ways. Now, without mentioning any names,
Irving Brecker. No, go ahead.
You just mentioned a name. Without mentioning any names, there were people I met who I admire from afar and wished I hadn't gotten quite so close to. I saw sides of them that I would have preferred not to see. I was, I wished I'd seen them, three fewer times in my life, so I hadn't seen an ugly side of them or a disappointing side of them. Did you ever feel any disappointment around Groucho?
No. It really was just a constantly replenishing, gratifying experience. The two negatives weren't his fault. One was he was mortal, and he had had strokes and had hardening of the arteries, and he was getting older and hazier and slower. So, that was a kind of a bittersweet element of getting close to my hero while he's fading out. And the other part was Erin Fleming's mercurial temperament. Again, not Groucho's fault, but no, there was nothing disappointing. He was impressive for a man in his mid-80s who'd had the physical problems health problems that he'd had. And no, there was nothing remotely disappointing about it. It was just a landmark period of my life that changed it.
Okay.
Hello, is this thing on?
Yes, no, that's fine. Now I'm going to tell a quick story here.
Yeah.
I was friends with a comedy writer named Jerry Davis. Jerry helped me get a couple of my partner, Dennis, who I think will be on this show one of these days soon, helped us get some of our early jobs. Jerry was quite a character. He was a producer mainly. He was a very colorful guy. The movie, the Bernard Slade play and movie Tribute, was kind of based on Jerry's life. Right. Jack Lemmon was playing Jerry in a way, and Jerry got a piece of those play and movie financial for using anecdotes from his actual life in the story. And Jerry was married late in life to an absolutely gorgeous, stunning woman, and he had the happiest marriage he could possibly have. During this time, he was producing the Odd Couple TV show. And there was an actress who came around. The punchline of the story is it was Erin Fleming, who was he met her someplace, and he was trying real hard to not be pestered by her. She was showing up on the lot and coming to his office and saying, "Jerry, I need a job. I'm trying to make a job as an actress. I'm broke. I'm not getting anywhere." And he one day said, "Well, I know someone who might need you." And he called up Groucho and said, you need an assistant of some sort? And that's how Groucho met Erin Fleming. Jerry said after this, that was the worst thing he ever did in his life. He was very guilty about that. Obviously, there were many sides to Erin Fleming. You and I have both encountered some people who thought she was on the whole, very good for Groucho, and he was lucky to have her. And I think you and I got into a debate with one of them not that long ago at a meeting of our group. So obviously, there's different sides to this.
People are very rarely all heroic or all villainous. And one of the quotes in my book is from André Gide, and it's that the color of truth is gray. And that's why it becomes difficult to just do in shorthand, she was good for him, she was bad for him. Because she came along at a time when his family had kind of, they had other priorities. They weren't interested in looking after him on a daily basis. And his last wife, Eden, had left him, and he was just kind of rattling around in this big ranch-style house in Beverly Hills. And she came along and picked him up and dusted him off and threw him back into the spotlight, for better or for worse, because a lot of people were upset about that because they felt he was too frail to go through that. But he loved performing, and he was very fond of Erin. And even though we would see this mercurial, difficult side of her, we worried that if somehow we were able to remove her from his circle, sort of like taking someone off of heroin, that, the withdrawal might be worse than having him, because he had grown very dependent on her for companionship, not in a sexual way. I've never met anyone that really thought that was part of it, but emotionally and for making decisions on his behalf. So it was that was kind of a stressful element, was trying to stay on Erin's good side, which was hard to find at times, but also look out for Groucho. And there was an attempted coup at one point where we did want to overthrow her and substitute another nurse who was young and attractive, but also didn't send his blood pressure sky high and cause him to burst into tears from screaming at him. But Erin got wind of that, and that all fell through, and she was in full control until towards the end, when the judge said, "You are not in charge of him anymore."
Okay. Now, I saw Erin Fleming twice. Once when Groucho came to the set of Welcome Back, Kotter, which I was working on at the time. And he was in no shape to do he came to do a cameo. I've told you this story, I tell it at other places. He came to do a cameo. He was in no shape to do it. And it was decided that he would just have his picture taken with the cast and leave. It did not dawn on me that night that he was under the influence of some drug, that he had taken something and that he wasn't functioning. Because having not seen him recently, I had nothing to compare him to.
A lot of people would think that he had been drinking because of the after effects of the stroke, with slurred speech and sluggish mind. And so that's, a lot of people miss, they'd say, I saw him once on the street in Beverly Hills and I think he was drunk. He didn't drink, so that wasn't it.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to reconcile this person who was there with the Groucho that I'd seen at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. He was kind of the same guy.
Yeah.
B, the Groucho that I'd met at Hillcrest Country Club many years earlier, who was alert and a real Groucho, and pretty fairly sharp, and you could talk to him easily.
Right, like on the Dick Cavett show.
Yeah, and of course the Groucho from the movies and TV show, and I got too many Grouchos on my head at the moment, and I'm actually standing there thinking, why is he here? And just then I hear Erin pitching our producer on the fact that Groucho would like it if she got a part on an episode of the TV show, and that moment characterized my view of her ever after. Well,
you're not wrong. And she she really didn't grasp his mortality. I think she thought that if she could scream and shake him, it would, there she is, it would knock the rust off of his brain. And I think, she really did put his life at peril the way that she, used him to try to further her own career. And, she was going to be the producer of a special, even after Groucho was confined to a wheelchair and was really, towards the end, she was still saying, oh, no, we're going to have a special from Groucho's living room and I'm going to produce it. And it's like, can't you see that he's beyond doing something like that? Again, he never stopped having that element of Groucho to him that would say funny things at the lunch table. But there's a difference in that and starring in a special. So in addition to the fact that she was trying to promote herself using Groucho, she put him at risk because she just refused to accept that, the decrescendo that was going on in his life.
I was uncomfortable when I saw him on the Dick Cavett show and her participation in those bits. I was uncomfortable by seeing her on stage at the Dorothy Chandler with him, trying to sing with him, which was not very pretty.
Yeah.
There was an episode of Bill Cosby's variety show that Groucho was on, which I think predates your entry into the Marx.
It was a year before.
Yeah. And I believe George Schlatter produced it. And what I remember from it, it doesn't seem to be on YouTube or anything anyplace. What I remember from it is that in the opening of the show, they would have the various cast members, Susan Tolsky and Foster Brooks, dance out and be introduced. And then that episode, Erin Fleming was introduced like she was a regular cast member and dances out in this little bare midriff outfit that they mugged one of the gold diggers to get for her. And it looked like she was going to be performing in the show. And then, as I recall, she wasn't. And my thought was that when Schlatter called and said, we want to have, Groucho come in and do a show, and we want him on the show, she said, he insists that I be on the show and that I be billed as a guest star or something of that sort. So they did that, indulged her, and taped something that they threw away with her, maybe. I'm just speculating beyond what I remember here. And that maybe there were other times in her times with Groucho. The only thing that she seemed to get out of her association with the Groucho was that very small part in one of Woody Allen's films. In Everything You Always Want to Know with Sex. Did she get anything else in terms of acting career?
Because of Groucho's influence, Woody cast her in Love and Death. She was supposed to play the Countess that has an affair with Woody, and she went off to Europe, and she came back, and we said, how'd it go? And she said, I walked off the set. Ridiculous. I told Woody there's no reason why my character can't have a little daughter. Erin was obsessed with having a child. She even had selected the name Solange to be her daughter's name, even though she would never have a child. And she had argued with Woody to change her character to allow for her to have a daughter, and Woody didn't want to. And so, according to her, she simply left and flew back home. So she was always her own worst enemy, carefully building a bridge and then setting fire to it.
Obviously, her last couple of years, she was not there mentally.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, she had been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. I mean, genuinely delusional, not just in her last years. Certainly in the years following Groucho's death in 1977, it worsened. But between the fact that she had psychological problems and had prescription and recreational drugs in her often, she was really unpredictable and could act outrageously. And then it really became bad in her last years when she, for a time, she was homeless. It's a sad ending. I mean, once Groucho was gone, she found out that, big surprise, these people weren't really that eager to continue to hang out with her. It was mostly because she was the dragon guarding the golden fleece, and once he was gone, and she continued behaving like she had been, but she did, trying to order people around and having shit fits. I don't think you realize who I am, but there's delusional stories about it. She ran into
Larry Gilbart's wife,
Pat.
Yeah.
And they were at some boutique, and Erin said, "Oh, this is the same color blue as the Pacific Design Center. It was designed by my father." And Mrs. Gelbart said, "It was, yes, Laurence Olivier. He was my father." And she was serious. I mean, it's like, someone who thinks they're Napoleon or something like that. So she was in and out of psych units in her last years, and it was, a rough final act, but a complex.
The one time I went to the house, I went with Gabe Kaplan. We got up there, and we were walking in. Carol O'Connor was leaving, looking like he was just glad to be out of there. And the atmosphere, now I don't know if you were at the house that day.
Not that day, but I met Carol O'Connor there.
Yeah, but the atmosphere was very bizarre. There were a lot of people around who looked like they just come to eat. Groucho was sitting there in this shirt with toys on it, with suspenders. He had he was dressed a little like a child in a way. That was my feeling. And he was sitting there in this party, and nobody was really talking to him because I think they didn't know what to say to him.
Right.
And then I was kind of some person who was working with Erin, I don't know who it was, kind of guided me over there. And Gabe had said that Marx knows a lot about the Marx Brothers, and I was like pushed next to him to talk to him. And I found I couldn't say anything more than just, "Gee, Groucho, I just watched Duck Soup again. That's a great movie." And he goes, "Yeah, that was a great movie." There was no substance there.
Yeah.
He was pleased that there was somebody there who seemed to be interested in him and talking to him, because the other people around there, it looked like they just wanted to say, "We were at Groucho's house and we got fed well."
There were a lot of hangers-on that were people that Erin knew, and she controlled the social the guest list at dinners. So she would meet people and have them come over, and they weren't people that he would have anything in common with. I immediately was drawn to his older circle of friends rather than Erin's kind of quirky, offbeat, younger people. And Groucho's friends appreciated the fact that a young whippersnapper like me knew who they were, but I was instantly more comfortable with Maury Riskind and Nat Perrin and Irv Brecker and the people that I'd known from the Groucho letters. Here they were in 3 dimensions and in color. But Erin had a coterie of bizarre pals, and yeah, they would come to parties or to dinner, and I think Groucho just kind of tolerated them, was sort of indifferent.
Well, I was going to ask you earlier, one of those questions we skipped by. When I met him at Hillcrest Country Club, and he was very lucid, I mentioned to him that I had been motivated to search out George S. Kaufman plays and S.J. Perelman books and other people like the Algonquin crowd, I guess you could call them, because of the connections, read about them in books about the Marx Brothers. And he was very pleased by that. He really, that was a very, in addition to thinking I got laid watching because of Marx Brothers movies, he was very pleased.
The big store.
Yeah, and I think at the time I met him, I was 19 or 20 maybe, I don't know. But I think I probably looked 12 to him or 14 to him. But I would assume it the same way. He was that he warmed to you because he didn't have to tell you who George Gershwin was. He didn't have to tell you who some of these other people were. And
I loved hanging out around his bookcase. And that's what turned me on to a lot of the Algonquin people. A lot of these were signed to him from Bob Benchley, and I would ask to borrow them, and he said, you can borrow any of my books that you want. Just make sure you bring them back. But you know,
where did those books wind up?
I think maybe of the special ones, Arthur might have been able to select some, but then if apparently there was like a rummage sale after Groucho died that I never knew about, which is really frustrating because it would have been nice to have something from his house. And I was in a bookstore in Hollywood and was looking through different books, and there was a book of the I can't remember the name of it, but it's books of interviews that George Plimpton oversaw. And there was one that had an interview with Perelman in it. I opened it up and it was inscribed from Dick Cavett to Groucho, and I remembered seeing it on Groucho's bookshelf. And here it was for sale. I didn't buy it, and I asked about it, and he said, yeah, there was a sale after Groucho died. I picked up a bunch of stuff. So some of it just got scattered to the four winds.
That's sad.
Yeah,
anyway,
I know.
Anyway, my impression of Erin Fleming, and I don't want to pretend like I had as much insight as you did, because all the time that I was around in the same room with Groucho, except for the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, put together would be less than an hour, probably. I think that visit to the house was about half an hour, and anyway, if you put them all together, maybe an hour. But my impression was that Erin was stage managing Hollywood gatherings she thought might help her. That some of these people might somehow give her a connection that would bolster her career. And that Groucho was kind of the forgotten man in his own party. And that he was there.
Well, I wouldn't get too melodramatic about it. People were in awe of him when they came over. They often didn't know what to say and kept in the background. But it wasn't as if there's this old guy and nobody's noticing him. I think it was just that they were sort of overwhelmed. But yes, Erin certainly hitched her wagon to his star, hoping it would pull her along with it, and it didn't really work out that way.
Okay, now I want to be leaving the topic of Groucho in a moment here. I want to leave time to talk about some of the other things you've done, Steve. But before I do that, I want to put you full screen here for a second. Would you? Oh, that's me. Excuse me.
Often confused.
Yes. Okay. Would you move slightly to your left? Just physically move slightly to your left. Okay. All right. There's the current edition of your book.
Yes.
Okay. Tell us about this book. People watching.
Well,
this is the second edition of the book.
Right, with the artwork by Drew Friedman on the front, which is pretty wonderful. Dick Cavett wrote the introduction, and I have sincere blurbs from Woody Allen and Steve Allen and Jack Lemmon and Cavett, which, I was very flattered to have gotten those. For years, I would have lunch with people or meet people, and they would ask me about my Groucho days, and I would tell them little pieces of it, and they would say, oh, you ought to write a book about that. And I'd think, I was such a footnote to his life. I came in when he was 84, and he died 3 years after that. What makes me think I could make a book out of that I wasn't important, and But at one point I thought, maybe I could cobble together some of the more interesting experiences I had and turn it into maybe a Vanity Fair or an Esquire article. And I thought, let me see how well I can reconstruct the sequence of events. And I sat down and started writing, and I was like on page 9 and hadn't met Groucho yet. And I thought, this is going to be longer than an article. Then, of course, I worried, which is really one of the things I'm gifted at, is worrying. I thought, I'm going to end up with something that's too long for an article and too short for a book. It'll just be like this 50-page thing. But as it turned out, the archaeologist in me, I went through copies of old letters and clippings and sat down. I contacted friends of mine that I'd written letters to, because I would come back from Groucho's and zip a piece of paper in the typewriter and say, so-and-so came over and Groucho said this and it was funny and it was interesting. And they would make copies of those and send it back. And I gradually pieced together this 3-year saga. And it was interesting because in putting it in chronological order, I felt myself going through the same emotional journey from naive, starstruck, gosh and gee golly kid from St. Louis, thrilled to meet his hero, through to this person that, clashed with Erin Fleming and was at the end in a position to say, Erin, it's time for you to leave now. And her having just a shit fit that fucking servants are treating her like a cockroach, she screamed to a friend on the phone at one point. And I, in a sort of condensed amount of time, went through that whole metamorphosis from wide-eyed kid to open-eyed cynic or maturing or something like that. And then, so the hardcover came out in '96. I had very good friends who said, I'm sure you'll have no trouble getting this published because you've got a ringside seat into one of the legends of entertainment history. You've got stories that have never been printed before and photos and all this. And I found out that was not the case. I had a cover letter that said, this is not a biography of Groucho Marx. It's the story of a fan whose dream came true, blah, blah, blah. And I would get rejection slips that said, we are not interested in any biographies of Groucho Marx at this time. And I would just want to strangle them and say, did you even read the cover letter? Never. But I finally found a publisher and the hardcover came out in '96. And then some years later, I decided to reissue it and have a chapter at the end that caught people up on some of the, dramatis personae that I had written about a dozen years earlier in the book. Some had died, some I had seen, some had given me feedback on the book after having read it. So there were still stories to tell that had occurred after the book had been published that involved the people who were in it. And so now it's available in paperback and Kindle and audiobook with me doing all the narration and the voices. And if I do have some copies on hand, if people want to get a signed or inscribed copy, they can go to my website, Steve Stoliar. As you see, it is STOLIAR, yes, .com, and I would be happy to sign a copy for you. Otherwise, you can find them on Amazon. I should say this clearly, not along the Amazon, because I had a number of people that flew down to Brazil trying to find the book and ended up in the rainforest and with the headhunters and so forth. So I would advise against that.
I kind of doubt that's true. Okay.
All right.
But one of the reasons that you and I met was that I was very impressed with the first edition of this book. And I wrote someplace.
What? Are you saying you weren't impressed with the second edition of the book? Goodbye. Hi.
That's your second fake exit. All right. And I thought, this thing rings real true to me. And it matched up with everything that I did know factually about it. And I had different emotions while reading it. There's points there where I envied you having that access to Groucho and being around him, and points where I was essentially saying, well, boy, I'm glad I wasn't there when that happened. I'm glad I didn't have to feel the responsibility of that basis and things like that. It was like an emotional roller coaster. And as you read the book, you can't help but think, well, why didn't somebody step in and do something about this? But there was no one. It was like predetermined. There was no way.
Initially, I mean, as I mentioned before, there was the feeling that Groucho was addicted to Erin, and by removing her, he would crumble. Also, there was an estrangement. There had been ups and downs between Groucho's son Arthur and Groucho that went way back before Erin Fleming was on the scene. But she also drove the wedge between Arthur, his son, and the two daughters, Miriam and Melinda. She sort of poisoned Groucho against his own children. And she kept saying, if Arthur ever was in charge of Groucho, he would put him in a home, and Groucho would hate that. And we never knew if that was just Erin's feverish imagination, or if, in fact, he would end up, as he would say, like Arthur Sheikman, and I never want to be in a place like Arthur Sheikman.
Well,
so
it seems to me like she didn't know that. She just was saying what she thought would manipulate Groucho.
We never knew
at
what
point.
But we had nothing to compare it with. Arthur was very rarely there during those years. He was sort of persona non grata, which is delicious with dry white wine, by the way. Yeah. I would try the persona.
Let me give you an impression here. I'm not doing impressions here. But my sense of this was that she initially came into Groucho's life because she needed some money, as per Jerry Davis, and right. she saw that she all of a sudden was now moving in higher show business circles. She was meeting more famous people. She was invited to more movie premieres, Hollywood parties, and such with Groucho. And for a while, she thought this would parlay into some sort of success in the acting career that she had not had. I think prior to that point, a bit part of Adam 12 was her biggest credit.
Well, she had some stage experience in her native Canada and out here.
Okay. But she was obviously not succeeding as an actress.
Correct.
And that as time went along, she kept thinking, well, I can parlay, being Groucho's manager, and I can become successmill producing some sort of Groucho thing that could lead to producing other things. And then Groucho, as he was failing, was undermining her plans because she couldn't get him on big TV shows anymore. That wasn't where he belonged in the last few years.
Right.
And then it became, well, I sacrificed my career for this man. I gave up the years when I could have been starring on my own TV show. I deserve reward for that. I deserve money for that. I deserve money from his estate for all the hours I put into him. And then she tried to grab as much as she could after he passed, or even as he was passing. Do you disagree with any of that?
Well, it's a tough thing because, and she was sued by the Bank of America and Arthur for having, sort of swindled him out of cash and exciting prizes. If Groucho had still been alive, he would have sworn on the stand that he wanted her to have those things, and that he cared a lot about her. So it would have been a difficult thing to try to make the case that she got them under false pretenses, because he would have said, no, I mean for her to have those. But ultimately, the jury found against Erin and for the Bank of America. So you got to wonder how she did in that trial when a jury of 12 people sided with the B of A over this woman crying and the foreman of the jury said, we felt like she had something to hide. We just didn't believe her. And she also freaked out in court and would scream. And, I think at one point the bailiff wanted to look in her purse, and she yanked it back and said, give me back my purse. Give it to me, you bitch. And the judge said, Miss Fleming, are you okay? And Erin said, I'm fine, Your Honor. You may have a problem. Not a good way to endear yourself to the judge.
You just answered the question as I was asking it. Was her behavior in court convinced them that she was not stable?
Yeah. And they've, and then she went on Ted Koppel's show that night, and that was a surreal thing. And he said, Erin, there was a $500,000 judgment against you. How are you going to pay for that? I was going to ask to borrow it from you, Ted. No, but seriously, Erin, I was going to put it on my MasterCard, Ted. It was. I felt so bad for Koppel because he's. And I mean, she was like, she had a wild look in her eyes. She had an attorney, Mr. Sabi, who was sort of like an Israeli Chico. He had an accent and was sort of like, you see, Your Honor, I did the best I could, but my client, I think she can't really be expected to. And Ted, I'd like to explain. And Koppel would say, well, I'm sure under other circumstances it would be enjoyable speaking with you, Mr. Sabi, but I'm trying to get some answers from Ms. Fleming. So it was, it just unraveled, and who could, I think they made the right decision, but, and of course they never collected because she didn't have any resources to attach at that point.
Now, you got a lot of things out of this relationship, not money necessarily, but you got, first of all, a wonderful story that people love to hear. And, I've been around you when people have been, you and I were, we met John Cleese one time. And
hey,
he told, how's that for a photo? And
it's like you knew I was going to be on tonight.
That's right. Amazing. And the minute you told Mr. Cleese that you would work for Groucho, his face lit up and he said, I want to talk to you. Stick around afterwards. I want to meet you. And you met through Groucho, you met people like Woody Allen.
There he is now. Rare smiling photo. Dick Cavett.
You got on the Gilbert Gottfried show.
Several times.
Yes. And you have advanced, you've also, advanced your career as a writer of comedy and as a voice actor, which you have. Yeah. I think some people in the chat room, here we got here, let's see, somebody here requesting an impression or two here, I believe here. Roy Curlin, I'm watching about 30 minutes behind. I hope Mr. Stoliar did his Cavett impression. It's amazing.
Say, Stoliar, I was wondering, did Groucho ever say that Erin was the kind of person who would... anyway, that's sort of my Cavett impression.
Okay. I was going to ask you... actually, one point I was going to suggest that you do the entire interview as Percy Helton. But everybody does that.
Everybody does. Percy Hilton, of course. I wasn't always just a kindly old man in those pictures. Sometimes I was. But there's some wonderful film noirs where I play a real pervert.
Anyway.
Yes. Big demand for Percy Hilton.
You actually met Gilbert Gottfried. I'm jealous. Seek out the two up. You were on twice on his show, or 3 times on Gilbert's show?
I did a third with Howard Storm as co-writers of Howard's memoir, The Imperfect Storm.
Which we will talk about next here, yes. But
Cavett was like a big brother to me, and not in an Orwellian sense. I owe him a lot, including being the bridge to getting to know Woody Allen.
Now here's someone who obviously listens to the Gilbert Gottfried show asked, did Chico really need the money?
Yes. I'll just leave it at that. I get really tired of that because it's like Pavlov's dog. If I post anything about Chico, there's invariably, he needed the money. Chico needed the money. Oh, he did this because he needed the money. And it's like, do you have to have this, hit the knee with a rubber hammer and your leg flips up thing? So I get kind of, it was funny the first 1,200 times, and then it got kind of tiresome. So Anyway,
someday they will link that with Cesar Romero and Danny Thomas and have the perfect Gilbert Gottfried.
Yes,
discussion
I
topic.
like to stand in a pool of lukewarm water and have young children shoot tangerines at my derriere. All right.
Steve Bilnitzer asks, "Hey guys, was Groucho aware of Sidney Sheldon's A Stranger in the Mirror, and if so, did he have any reaction to it?"
It's interesting. Stranger in the Mirror was a story about an aging comedian who is taken advantage of by an ambitious young actress who puts his life at peril. Wherever did he get an idea like that? I don't know. But apparently it was also partly based on Milton Berle, because the aging comedian was supposed to have a legendarily large organ. And I don't mean a Wurlitzer.
Okay.
But Groucho, there are photos of Groucho holding the book open, which were just taken at the launch party for the book. But in fact, he never read it. I don't know what he would have thought of it. And Sheldon actually dedicated the book to Groucho as a sort of wake-up call to see what the situation with Erin and him was really like. But he never did get around to reading it. And that was another case where it was virtually impossible to second-guess Erin Fleming's reaction to something, because something we thought would be completely innocuous, she would have a shit fit and slam the door and scream and throw things. And then other things we thought, oh no, when she hears about this, there's going to be hell to pay. And so when his book, when Stranger in the Mirror came out, we thought she's going to go crazy because it paints the Erin character as this crazy, murderous, horrible villainess. And instead she just, oh, that's just Sidney. So there was no way to second guess what she would do. But no, Groucho was photographed with it, but never read it.
For those who don't know, Sidney Sheldon was a TV producer, probably most famous for I Dream of Jeannie. And Groucho made a cameo. He was a friend of Groucho's, and Groucho made a cameo in one episode of that show.
But he won an Oscar for The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer. So right. Before he made all those, pulp fiction books, he did have an Oscar to his name.
Rob with 3 A's. I remember Groucho appearing in Bob Hope's Joy's NBC special with so many guest stars about 1976. He looked so old. Was that his last TV appearance?
It should have been. There were a couple after that. That was rough. I was actually on the set because I'd gotten to be friendly with Hal Cantor, who was producing it. And legendary writer and raconteur. So there wasn't an audience for the scenes that Groucho was in, so I was able to show up for that. And I actually thought Groucho did pretty well for Groucho, because I was so used to seeing him slowed down and kind of not very animated. So I thought he sort of rose to the challenge pretty well, but I'm sure for the audience at home, they had the same impression I did at the Dorothy Chandler, which is how old and frail he is. I also got to see a kind of an ugly side of Bob Hope, because he after each take, he would go look at the tape of it in the tape replay and see how he looked. And he looked and said, geez, what the hell's going on with my hair? And he pulled the hairdresser aside and he said, do you know what you're doing? Look at that. Look at that. What do you think you're doing here? And just gave him a tongue lashing in front of everyone that was there. And, the poor guy didn't know what to say. And I don't know what Hope saw that it wasn't always there, because it was sort of thinning hair with paint and enhancements of some sort. But, man, he laid into that guy that day.
I was on the set of a couple of Bob Hope tapings, and he was not very nice to the crew. Every time he read a line wrong, it was the cue card guy's fault.
Yeah.
What was Groucho's last public appearance?
Public appearance?
Well, on TV.
I think it was a Mike Douglas show about Ernie Kovacs, and Edie Adams was on, and Erin was on.
If he had appeared on that episode of Cotter he came into, would that have been his last appearance?
I think all of these things are 76. So I can't remember exactly when Cotter would have been in relation to that. It would probably, Cotter would have been slightly before that, but not by much.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a question. Lynn Padden. Hello, Mr. Steve. Did you meet any silent movie stars through Groucho?
Silent movie stars. Wow. I can't offhand think of any. I mean, I met people that were in vaudeville, certainly concurrent with silent film, but I didn't meet Chaplin or Keaton or actresses. No, I guess not. Sorry, Lynn.
From Damondo, a question to you both. What jokes would Groucho consider too lowbrow even for his taste? Was Groucho one of those comedians who was shocked at what some comedians of the day were getting away with?
Yes. He was one of those that said, a dirty laugh is an easy laugh. It doesn't take anything to get a laugh by saying dirty words. You have to be clever. You have to be funny. However, he was capable of salty language in the privacy of his home. But it wasn't that often, really. Most of the jokes that he came up with that I witnessed weren't about dirty stuff. But he did feel that that wasn't the same as a talented stand-up who carefully honed his act over years just to come out and say, Richard Pryor and I guess Lenny Bruce years earlier. He didn't really go for that. He was fans of Dick Cavett and Woody Allen because they had that same kind of cerebral, clever, absurd funniness. So I don't think he would have, I don't think he would have thought, for instance, that The Aristocrats was funny, even though I think it's hysterical.
I had a series of experiences where I was around veteran comedians. I'll use Milton Berle as an example. This is a true situation. I was at the Friars Club when there was a Friars Club in Beverly Hills, and Milton was being interviewed by a TV crew. I think it was Entertainment Tonight, and he's talking about, I tell all the comedians today not to work blue. He said, I say that thing, it's easy to get laughs with dirty words. You should work for the whole family. He goes on, scolding them. And then when they yell cut and they start packing up the camera, he told 2 or 3 of the dirtiest jokes that would have made Larry Flint blush. And there was no sense of that
hypocrisy.
It was just completely, I was looking like, does he understand that he's now doing the rebuttal to what he just said? And there was nothing. And I got that a lot. Red Skelton told me some of the filthiest jokes you ever heard in your life while lecturing people about, the American flag and such. I
guess they drew the line on whether it was for public consumption or not, that they were in high dudgeon if it was coming out on stage and doing those. But just, between the guys in the back room, I'll tell you a dirty story. I guess they didn't see that as hypocritical.
Ryan Puglioli, how often did Zeppo and Gummo come over to Groucho's house?
Oh, it was more than a few times, but not often, because they lived in Palm Springs, so it was kind of a big schlep to come up to Beverly Hills. But they all got along well, the 3 remaining brothers, and it really was cool to watch their interaction, like at that dinner where Gummo said, "What do you want with her feet?" Watching them back and forth, I thought, what must it have been like when all 5 were alive and at the height of their mental powers?
And Rob again, did Groucho know of Alan Alda's oft-used impression of him in the MASH TV series or other such impressions? Did he like those? Now, I can answer part of this because the reason Groucho wound up coming over to Welcome Back, Kotter to do the cameo that never happened was that Gabe Kaplan was always doing Groucho impressions on the show. And one day, Groucho phoned Gabe Kaplan at the studio, got him on the phone, and said, "I'm going to sue you.
That's nice.
For stealing my, you're imitating me, you're stealing my material, I'm going to sue you." And Gabe, without blinking an eye, said, "Okay, fine, sue me. Why don't you come over and do a cameo on the show?" And he said, okay,
Wow.
but I'm still going to sue you. And there was no more talk of a lawsuit. But a couple of weeks later, Groucho was on the set, and it was a very, it was my second day on staff on Cotter and my first day of a taping, and it was one of the most surreal days of my life because there was something fascinating happening every minute, something new to me. Earlier that day, I got trapped in the elevator with Olivia Newton-John and Elliot Gould, and we had, and then we had a bunch of stars, kids on the show that night. Richard Shaw and Valerie Harper's daughter, Wendy, was in the episode, and Lee Grant's daughter, whose name is escaping me at the minute, Dinah Manoff, I think I wrote Dinah Manoff's first line she ever said on television. That was her first part. She was there. So the parents were there, and our mutual friend, Mike Preminger, was doing the warm-up that night, and no one had told him Groucho was going to be there. And he's out in front of the curtain doing the warm-up to the audience, and all of a sudden Groucho Marx, with his little beret on, is shuffling past him, and he did not know this was coming, and managed to handle it fine. But it was a very bizarre situation to have Groucho there, and there was this ABC staff photographer there who was taking pictures, and I remembered that on the record that is allegedly of the Carnegie Hall concert, but is actually made up of a composite of two different concerts Groucho did.
Right, San Francisco.
Dick Cavett in his intro said, "Don't take any flash pictures; they make Groucho dizzy." So I went to the photographer and just conveyed this to him, and he said to me, "Don't worry, there's plenty of light, and no one will ever see these pictures. We're just going to take them and dump them." And after that, I kept asking, can you get me one of those photos? Because I was in a couple of them. I wanted my picture for obvious reasons, but I also thought it was a very interesting thing. And nobody at ABC could find them. Nobody knew they'd ever been there. Nobody knew Groucho had ever been on the set. And I told this story to some people, and they started doubting it had ever happened. And then the photos showed up. There's a few of them on the internet.
Right.
And I am cropped. One of them is cropped with me just on the outside of it. But it was and then he was gone. It was like he'd never been there. So anyway, now we know Mike Preminger from a group you're a part of, that I'm a part of, called Yarmy's Army.
Yes.
For those who don't know, Yarmy's Army started as kind of a support group for older comedians. It was named after a man named Dick Yarmy, who was Don Adams' brother, Don Adams' real name being Donald Yarmy. And when Dick was dying of cancer, this group sprung up to kind of keep Dick company and amuse him. And after he passed, it stayed together, and I was brought in as a member, and then I brought other people in as a member. I think I brought you into the group, Steve.
You did.
And we meet every so often, and it's no longer, unfortunately, it's no longer, Louis Nye and Pat McCormick and Tim Conway.
No,
and
they're
Harvey
letting
Korman.
people like me in.
Yes, they're letting us in, right? But Mike Preminger is a member of that, and the guy who runs it is a friend of ours named Howard Storm. Tell him a little who Howard Storm, what his credentials are, because he's an amazing guy with so much show business history.
He's famous for being quite the raconteur, and he grew up on the Lower East Side of New York with, hey, there we are, pretending to be simultaneously signing copies of the book we co-wrote, The Imperfect Storm from Henry Street to Hollywood, because Henry Street was Howard's old neighborhood in New York. And he grew up with gangsters and criminals, and then in the 50s played a lot of mobbed up clubs with shady characters, and then was represented by Jack Rollins, who was one of the classier managers. He managed Woody Allen and Dick Cavett and Nichols and May, and started getting better gigs. But as the cliche goes, what he really wanted to do was direct. And he ended up doing real well for himself. His first gig was a few episodes of Rhoda, and he also directed Taxi and Laverne and Shirley. and then every episode of the first 3 years of Mork and Mindy. And he has a lot of just remarkable insight into Robin Williams, comparing and contrasting him with Jonathan Winters, who was Williams' idol. He was Howard was a very much in demand TV director. Basically, until he took a stand supporting Valerie Harper when NBC sued her, and she said it was wrongful termination. And he was expected to be a good soldier on behalf of the network, and instead they had him on the stand, and the NBC's attorney said, would you consider yourself a friend of Miss Harper's? Yes. As a matter of fact, wasn't she responsible for your directing work? Yes. So would it be fair to say, Mr. Storm, that there isn't anything you wouldn't do for her? And Howard said, no. And the guy said, well, what wouldn't you do for her? And he said, lie. And he said he remembers seeing Valerie's attorney whisper something into her ear, and she smiled. And she later told him that the attorney said, we just won the case. And they did win, but Howard was blacklisted, not for being a communist, but because he wouldn't play the corporate game. And it took a while for him to get back into the swing of things. But, he's a man of great integrity and funny and interesting. And he liked my Groucho book, and people had told him he directed a play with Dick Cavett that was about Cavett and Mary McCarthy and who was the playwright that did? Oh God, how could I blank on it? Oh well, I'm entitled. Anyway, after each performance, Howard would tell the cast stories. Oh, Lillian Hellman was the other one. Howard would tell them stories, and Cavett would say, Howard, you've got to put these down. These are great stories. And one time I called Howard and I said something similar to him. I said, when you go, he's 88 now, you're taking all these stories with you. And Howard said, I know myself, and I know I will never be able to do this by myself. Will you write it with me? And it was a real pleasure, siphoning off stories from his brain into the tape recorder and then giving it substance and drawing him out on some of the darker elements of his life with, death and illness and crises of confidence and stuff, in and around all of his great funny stories. So
it's quite a wonderful book, and the kind of person who would find this talk interesting would enjoy the hell out of that book.
If you're going to use language like hell, I'm going to fake another exit.
Okay,
No.
well, we're almost to the end here anyway, Steve.
Oh, well.
So you don't have to fake, or you can actually make a real exit in a minute.
And it won't make any difference.
Yes, anyway. So we recommend that book highly, and there you go, anyway. And several of my friend Peter Sanderson came in a little. I didn't see the comment. He came in with the answer there for you.
Somehow I managed to retrieve it from the applesauce that passes for my brain.
Robert Rose asks, apart from Steve's own book, what are your favorite books about or by the Marx Brothers? I'd particularly be curious as to Steve's impression of Arthur Marx's books.
I don't do impressions of books. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, we both liked Joe Adamson's book.
Joe Adamson's book,
tremendously.
yes.
It's called Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and sometimes Zeppo.
Right.
We both liked Groucho's own books. If you're interested in the Marx Brothers, you should read every book Groucho wrote.
Right. Harpo Speaks.
And Harpo Speaks. And
then the book Monkey Business by who wrote that? Where is it? British fellow.
Yeah.
Well, someone will zap it to you now. I thought that's probably the best book on as a biography of the brothers. Joe's is the best book that's an examination of the films, partly because Joe has such a great sense of humor and doesn't hesitate to use it, for which he was pilloried when it first came out by people saying, why are you trying to be funny? And the answer is, because we're writing about the Marx Brothers, and it shouldn't be dry and dull. But
Simon Luvish.
yes, Simon Luvish. Thank you, B Button.
Anyway,
Bruce.
Okay. If you are interested in the Marx Brothers, and I don't know why you'd be watching this if you weren't.
Why you'd still be watching this?
Those books are all pretty much in print, or they're easy to find rather inexpensively. And it's not hard to amass a good library of them. But start with Steve's book because it's a really
because I'm
good
sitting
book.
here.
No. Well, Steve, you're sitting here because we became friends, and we became friends because I liked your book. So indirectly, it's the other way around.
Okay.
But I've known Steve now, like I said, for 8 years. He came to my.
I think it's 9 years since we started the podcast.
That's right, probably. Anyway, so it's time for another party.
Fine.
That was a fun party. That was a nice party. Now
it was.
My mother had it. It was the last time my mother was out of the house for non-medical reasons.
Yeah.
And she had the time of her life, meeting all my friends, and they enjoyed meeting her. And that's.
And what mother wouldn't like dozens and dozens of people raving about her son to her?
And I paid every one of them to say that.
You still owe me, but I didn't get you a present, so.
Okay, well, it all balances out, and it's been nice. I was gonna say it's been nice knowing you, Steve, but we're not gonna part after this. So anyway, our week here of Groucho discussions continues Thursday night with Mr. Frank Ferranti. This show will replay ad infinitum on YouTube after it ends. We have several questions in the comments section, the answers to which are, you should have seen the first half of the show. We covered these things already, so I didn't read those questions. But if you watch the rest of it, you'll see the answers to your questions. And Phil Geiger says, Mark and Steve, you're increasing my must-read list by several titles. Thanks. Good.
Happy to do it. I hope that it lives up to your expectations.
Good. Steve, thank you for joining me, spending this time with us.
My pleasure. Did we make any sense?
No, none whatsoever. But,
good.
They're Marx Brothers fans. They're used to things that don't make sense. And now we will both sing like Maurice Chevalier to get out of here, in order to exit.
When the nightingales sing like you, sing much better than they do, because you brought a new kind of love to me.
That's an impression. Steve.
Wait a minute. Can I get one more story? Can I get one more story in?
Sure. Okay.
Dick Cavett told me that when he was writing for the Merv Griffin show, there was one show where Bob Hope and Maurice Chevalier were the guests. So Hope and Chevalier were in the green room, and Cavett, who always saw himself as just this kid from Nebraska, he never really got over being starstruck. He thought, I'm going to hang around the green room and see what Maurice Chevalier and Bob Hope talk about. So he went into the green room, and he hears Hope say, hey, Maurice, you look terrific, man. What's your secret? And Chevalier said, well, I'll tell you, Bob, I don't drink and I don't fook. And Hope said, really? Do you sook? So you see, he didn't always need cue cards, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, I want to tell you, thank you for joining us, folks. Thank you, Steve.
My pleasure.
Show, like I said, will be repeating forever on YouTube. Good night.